Laughter echoed off the marble patio, sharp and brittle like shattering glass. They thought the battered paper envelope was a joke, an economy boarding pass to a nowhere town. Let them wheeze, I thought, fingers tracing the cheap print. They didn't know it was a one-way ticket to their ruin. Sweat gathered at the base of my neck, gluing the stiff, scratching silk of my dress to my skin. It was 90 degrees out, with a humidity that felt like breathing through a wet wool blanket, but Evelyn had insisted on an afternoon garden party. It was supposedly a joint high school graduation celebration. In reality, it was a coronation for Chloe. We were exactly 5 months apart in age. I was the adopted charity case, the desperate purchase they made when the fertility clinics told them to give up. Chloe was the biological miracle conceived right after the ink dried on my custody paperwork. From the moment she took her first breath, I became obsolete. A piece of slightly scuffed furniture sitting awkwardly in the corner of their sprawling, sterile mansion. The air in the backyard hung thick with the cloying scent of roasted figs, overpriced Prosecco, and Evelyn's heavy gardenia perfume. Caterers in suffocating black uniforms navigated the travertine tiles, passing out miniature quiches that tasted like seasoned cardboard. I stood near the massive stone fire pit unlit, naturally chewing on the inside of my cheek until I tasted the metallic tang of copper. "Smile, Riley," Richard muttered as he brushed past me, a sweating tumbler of scotch clutched in his fleshy hand. He didn't look at me. He rarely did. "You look like you're attending a wake. Try to be grateful." Grateful. That was their favorite word to use on me, a verbal weapon disguised as guidance. I forced the corners of my mouth upward, watching Chloe hold court by the pool. She was wearing a custom-tailored linen sundress that flowed effortlessly, her blonde hair catching the afternoon sun perfectly. I tugged at the restrictive collar of my own dress, a heavy emerald thing Evelyn had bought on clearance 2 years ago that pinched my armpits and smelled faintly of mothballs. The clinking of a spoon against crystal brought the dull roar of the party to a halt. Evelyn stood on the veranda, beaming. "Everyone, if we could gather around the gift table. It's time to spoil our graduates." The crowd of hedge fund managers, real estate agents, and plastic surgeons shuffled closer, forming a suffocating ring of linen suits and designer sunglasses. Chloe, naturally, went first. Her manicured hands tore into perfectly wrapped boxes, diamond stud earrings, a trip to Milan with her friends. And then Richard handed her a small velvet box. Chloe opened it, squealed loudly enough to make my ears ring, and pulled out a silver key fob. A brand new convertible was parked in the circular driveway. The crowd applauded as if she had just cured a disease. I watched her jump up and down, the scent of fresh leather and unearned privilege radiating off her. My jaw ached from clenching it. "Now, Riley," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with the kind of saccharine pity she reserved for wounded animals and service workers. She gestured to a small pile of envelopes at the far edge of the table. "Your turn, sweetheart." I stepped forward. The silence from the crowd wasn't expectant. It was tolerant. I opened the first few. Generic cards from Evelyn's bridge partners. $50 bills. A gift card to a chain bookstore. I mumbled my thanks, my voice sounding hollow and flat even to my own ears. Then I reached the bottom of the pile. It wasn't a pristine white cardstock envelope. It was a battered, brown manila rectangle, crinkled at the edges and smelling faintly of damp tobacco and old pine. It looked jarringly out of place against the crisp white tablecloth. There was no return address, just my name Riley, written in a shaky, heavy-handed scrawl, and a postmark from Astoria, Oregon. I slid my thumb under the flap, ripping the cheap paper. A single sheet of printer paper fell out, folded unevenly. I opened it. It was an airline itinerary. Economy class. Spirit Airlines. A one-way ticket from our city to Portland, with a connecting bus route to Astoria. Evelyn leaned over my shoulder, her breath hot and smelling of peppermint and gin. She let out a sharp, breathless laugh. "Oh my, did someone send you a coupon for a bus tour, honey?" Chloe snickered, twirling her new car keys around her index finger. "Ew, Spirit? Do they even have seats? Or do you just hold onto a pole in the back?" A ripple of laughter tore through the guests. Richard chuckled, taking a long sip of his scotch. Looks like you're flying cargo, kiddo. Who sent that? One of your little friends from the public library? I didn't answer them. The noise of the party, the laughter, the ice clinking, the hum of the central AC unit faded into a low, buzzing static. My eyes were locked on the billing information printed at the bottom corner of the page. Purchased by Arthur Pendleton. My lungs seized. The air suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Arthur Pendleton, my biological grandfather, the man Richard and Evelyn had explicitly told me died in a drunk driving accident when I was 7. The man they claimed was a monster who hadn't cared enough to even contest my adoption. My thumbs pressed hard into the paper, creating deep indentations. He was alive. He bought this. Well? Evelyn pressed, her perfectly painted eyebrows raised in mock concern. Are you going to tell us who sent the garbage? I looked up at her, really looked at her. I saw the tight, desperate pull of her facelift, the cold calculation in her eyes. I looked at Richard, red-faced and smug. I looked at Chloe, oblivious and cruel. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to flush red, to throw the paper away, to apologize for the interruption and fade back into the wallpaper. Instead, a strange electric calm washed over me. The resentment I'd been swallowing for 18 years solidified into something hard and sharp in my chest. Just a mistake, I said softly, my voice completely steady. I folded the paper carefully, treating the cheap, crumpled itinerary with more reverence than anything I had ever touched in this house, and slid it into my pocket. I didn't cry. I didn't snap. I just gave them a slow, jagged little smile that made Evelyn take a half step back. Let them laugh. They had no idea that their meticulously curated world was about to catch fire. The house smelled like ozone, stale citrus cleaner, and exhaustion after the caterers finally packed up and left. It was 3 a.m. The central air conditioning hummed through the vents, a relentless artificial breathing that usually put me to sleep. Tonight, it sounded like a countdown. I stood in the center of my bedroom, a space decorated by an interior designer to look like a generic teenager's room from a catalog. Pale pinks, sterile whites, nothing that actually belonged to me. I had already stripped off the horrific emerald silk dress, leaving it crumpled on the pristine rug like a dead beetle. I was in my own clothes now, faded black jeans, a worn-out band t-shirt, and heavy combat boots. Clothes I bought myself with money earned from a part-time job they hated me having. An old black canvas duffel bag sat on my mattress. I wasn't taking much, just the things that mattered. A few books, my clothes, my phone charger. I didn't want their jewelry or their electronics. I wanted to leave completely clean. But I couldn't leave empty-handed. Not yet. The stairs didn't creak as I descended into the cavernous darkness of the ground floor. I knew exactly where to step. 18 years of making myself invisible had taught me the architecture of silence. I bypassed the kitchen and moved silently down the hallway toward Richard's home office. The heavy mahogany door was closed but unlocked. I pushed it open, wincing at the faint click of the latch. The room smelled oppressively of leather polish, old paper, and Richard's expensive cigars. I turned on the small brass desk lamp, casting a tight circle of yellow light across the blotting pad. The safe was built into the wall behind a framed map of the city. Classic Richard, unoriginal even in his secrecy. I swung the frame open and stared at the digital keypad. He was a creature of habit and immense ego. I punched in Chloe's birthday. Beep, 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 beep. Red light. Incorrect. I frowned, biting the inside of my lip. I tried his anniversary. Red light. I stood there in the quiet, the smell of leather thick in my nose, thinking, what did Richard value more than anything else? I exhaled slowly, my fingers hovering over the keys. I typed in the date of his company's IPO. Click. A heavy, mechanical thud echoed from inside the wall, and the green light flashed. I pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside were stacks of velvet jewelry boxes, thick envelopes of emergency cash, and several thick, accordion-style legal files. I ignored the cash. I pulled out the files, dumping them onto the desk. The rough texture of the thick paper scraped against my skin as I flipped frantically through property deeds and tax returns until I found it. A dark blue folder labeled P Custody Trust. I opened it, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. Words swam in the dim light. Estates, fiduciary, conservatorship, and then a clear, unmistakable ledger. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just a standard adoption record. It was a financial agreement. When my biological mother died, a massive trust had been established by her family, by Arthur. The money was meant for my upbringing, locked away until I turned 25, but with a massive monthly stipend allocated to my caretakers for my housing, education, and specialized needs. I wasn't a charity case. I was a revenue stream. They had taken Arthur's money, my money, for 18 years, while feeding me a narrative that I owed them my life. They used my stipend to fund their lifestyle, to buy Chloe's car, to throw this very graduation party. And to keep the money flowing, they had forged legal documents claiming Arthur was an unfit, dangerous alcoholic who had died, severing all my legal ties to him while quietly cashing the checks. My hands shook, but not from fear. It was a white-hot, blinding rage. It tasted like battery acid in the back of my throat. I didn't take the cash from the safe. I took the blue folder, shoving it aggressively into the front pocket of my duffel bag. I left the safe wide open, the empty space screaming louder than any note I could have written. Stepping out of the front door, the oppressive humidity of the day had finally broken, leaving behind a cool, damp night. The gravel crunched loudly beneath my boots. I didn't look back at the dark, silent mansion. The Uber ride to the airport was a blur of orange streetlights washing over the cracked vinyl seats. The driver, a tired-looking man chewing aggressively on spearmint gum, didn't ask questions. The airport at 4 a.m. was a liminal space. It smelled of floor wax and stale pretzels. The fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. Walking through TSA, feeling the cold, gritty tile on my bare feet, the reality of what I was doing began to settle in. I was entirely alone. I had $40 in my checking account, and a piece of stolen paper that proved my life was a lie. The flight was brutal. Cramped legs jammed against the hard plastic of the seat ahead of me, the constant crying of a toddler 2 rows back, the smell of recycled breath and cheap jet fuel. I didn't sleep a wink. I just stared out the scratched acrylic window as the flat brown landscape gave way to towering green mountains and a slate gray ocean. When the wheels hit the tarmac in Portland, the plane shook violently, rattling my teeth. I felt a grim satisfaction in the rough landing. The bus ride to Astoria took another 3 hours. As we drove, the sterile luxury of the world I knew vanished entirely, replaced by towering, oppressive pine trees and low-hanging fog. When I finally stepped off the bus at the depot, the cold air slapped me across the face. It smelled of salt, dead fish, and wet earth. It was a raw, aggressive smell, a real smell. I stood on the cracked concrete curb, gripping the strap of my duffel bag. The sky above was bruised and gray. A rusted, dark blue Ford pickup truck idled near the edge of the lot, its exhaust sputtering white smoke into the cold air. The driver's side door groaned open, screaming against rusted hinges. An old man stepped out. He was tall, stooped at the shoulders, wearing a flannel jacket that had seen better decades. His face was weathered, deeply lined like a dried riverbed, his hands thick and calloused. He didn't run toward me. He didn't smile warmly. He just stood by the open door of the truck, taking a long, slow drag from a cigarette, his gray eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. I walked toward him, my boots heavy on the wet pavement. "Riley," he said. His voice sounded like gravel being crushed under a tire. It wasn't a question. "Arthur?" I replied, my voice shaking just a fraction. He flicked his cigarette onto the wet ground and crushed it under his boot. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. "Took you long enough. Get in." It wasn't a fairy tale. It was gritty, cold, and smelled like gasoline and old regrets. But as I threw my bag into the bed of the rusted truck and climbed into the torn vinyl passenger seat, I breathed deeply for the first time in 18 years. I was finally home. Rain started hitting the windshield of the truck about 10 minutes out of the depot. It wasn't a gentle drizzle. It was a heavy, relentless drumming that sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the glass. The wipers dragged across the pane with a loud, rhythmic, rubbery squeal. The inside of the cab smelled of wet wool, damp dog, and stale Folgers coffee. The heater blasted dry, scorching air directly onto my shins, making the cold sweat on my skin evaporate into a sticky film. Arthur drove with both hands, gripping the cracked leather steering wheel, his knuckles white. He didn't try to make small talk. I appreciated that. I was running on empty, my adrenaline crashing hard, leaving behind a hollow, ringing exhaustion. We pulled off the main highway onto a winding two-lane road flanked by towering Sitka spruces. The trees swallowed the gray morning light, plunging us into a gloomy, green-tinted twilight. After a few miles, the truck tires crunched off the asphalt and onto a rutted dirt driveway. The house was a small, single-story structure clad in weathered cedar shingles that had turned a silvery bone gray from years of salt wind. It sat perched on a slight rise overlooking a rocky shoreline. There was no manicured lawn, no geometric topiary, no three-car garage, just tall, unruly beach grass, a stack of split firewood covered by a blue tarp, and a rusted-out crab pot leaning against the porch railings. Arthur cut the engine. The sudden absence of the roaring exhaust left my ears ringing. He unbuckled his seatbelt, the mechanism snapping back with a loud clatter. "Watch your step on the boards," he said, his voice grating in the quiet cab, rotten in the middle. I grabbed my duffel bag and slid out. The wind off the water was sharp and freezing, instantly cutting through my thin t-shirt and biting into my bones. I followed him up the sagging wooden steps, carefully stepping over a splintered plank, and waited as he forced a brass key into a stubborn deadbolt. The door gave way with a heavy groan. Stepping inside, my senses were immediately flooded. The house smelled intensely of wood smoke, old paper, and a faint, sharp tang of brass polish. It was cluttered, but deliberately so. Stacks of maritime history paperbacks lined the hallway. A worn, faded plaid sofa dominated the small living room, facing an iron wood stove that radiated a dull, residual heat. It was a lived-in space. It felt entirely alien. "Kitchen's back there," Arthur mumbled, shrugging off his heavy flannel jacket and hanging it on an iron hook by the door. "I'll make coffee. Sit." I dropped my bag on the braided rug and walked into the kitchen. It had yellowing linoleum floors and cabinets painted a faded seafoam green. I pulled out a wooden chair and sat at the small, scratched Formica dining table. My legs felt like lead. Arthur moved around the kitchen with the slow, deliberate economy of a man used to being alone. He filled a battered aluminum percolator with water, scooped dark grounds into the basket, and set it on the gas stove. A blue flame flared to life with a soft whomp. He sat down opposite me. Up close, under the harsh glare of the overhead bulb, he looked older than he had in the parking lot. His eyes were deeply hooded, surrounded by fragile, bruised-looking skin. He stared at me, his gaze dissecting my face feature by feature. "You got her chin," he said quietly. "And her temper, it looks like. If you're sitting here instead of that country club." I swallowed hard. My throat felt like sandpaper. "They told me you were dead, Arthur. A drunk driver." 7 years old, they sat me down in Richard's leather-bound office and told me you wrapped your car around a telephone pole. Arthur didn't flinch, but his jaw muscle leaped tight under his gray stubble. He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, looked at them, and shoved them back. "I was drinking back then, after your mother passed. Heavily. But I never drove, and I never stopped fighting for you. Richard's lawyers, they were sharks. They buried me in injunctions, psychiatric evaluations, character assassinations. By the time I sobered up, the ink on your adoption papers was dry, and the restraining order was permanent. He let out a slow, ragged breath. I bought that ticket on a prayer, put it in the cheapest envelope I could find, hoping they'd think it was junk mail and pass it to you. I figured, you turned 18, the legal leash was off. Maybe you'd want to know where you came from. I didn't say anything. I unzipped my duffel bag. My hands were shaking, trembling so violently the metal zipper teeth rattled against each other. I reached in and pulled out the thick, dark blue legal folder. I dropped it on the Formica table. It hit with a heavy, satisfying thud. They didn't keep me because they wanted a daughter, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. They kept me because I was a paycheck. Arthur frowned, pulling a pair of reading glasses from his shirt collar. He dragged the folder across the table and flipped it open. The kitchen was dead silent, save for the rising, rhythmic bubbling of the percolator on the stove. I watched his eyes scan the ledgers, the forged fiduciary statements, the monthly withdrawal receipts from the trust his family had set up. I watched him read the line items where my mother's money paid for Chloe's private equestrian lessons, Evelyn's quarterly trips to a Swiss dermatology clinic, and the mortgage on a vacation home in Aspen I was never allowed to visit. Arthur's hands stopped moving. He stared at a single page, a forged signature authorizing a massive lump sum transfer meant for my college fund, routed directly into Richard's LLC. Slowly, Arthur took his glasses off. He didn't yell. He didn't slam his fist on the table. Instead, a terrifying, absolute stillness settled over him. When he looked up at me, his gray eyes were pitch black, completely devoid of light. They hollowed out her legacy, he whispered, his voice cracking with a grief so profound it made my own chest ache. To buy their groceries. They forged your death certificate to secure sole survivorship of the trust, I added, pointing a trembling finger at the final page in the stack. Richard had a judge sign off on it, a judge he plays golf with. Arthur stood up. He walked over to the stove, turned off the burner, and poured 2 mugs of black, sludgy coffee. He set one down in front of me. The ceramic was chipped and hot against my cold fingers. Drink, he ordered softly. You're going to need the caffeine. For what? I asked, looking down at the dark, oily surface of the coffee. Arthur leaned over the table, his thick, calloused finger tapping the blue folder. Because we aren't just going to sue them, Riley. We're going to dismantle them. I slept for 14 hours. When I finally woke, the bedroom was freezing, the air biting at my nose and cheeks. The mattress was lumpy, covered in heavy handmade quilts that smelled faintly of lavender and dust. I lay there for a long time, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, listening to the relentless crashing of the ocean against the rocks outside. It wasn't a nightmare. The sterile mansion, the emerald dress, the fake smiles, they were 3,000 miles away. I reached blindly for my jeans on the floor and fished my phone out of the pocket. The screen was a chaotic block of notifications. The battery was at 12%. 74 missed calls, 28 text messages, 12 voicemails. A cold, dark spike of satisfaction drove itself into my stomach. I sat up, pulling a heavy quilt over my shoulders, and tapped the voicemail icon. I wanted to hear it. I needed to hear the exact moment their arrogant, insulated reality collapsed. The first message was from Evelyn, timestamped 6:15 a.m. Riley? Sweetheart, where are you? The caterers left the back gate open and your bed hasn't been slept in. Please call me back. You're scaring me. Are you at the library again? Her voice was an octave higher than usual, dripping with that unbearable, breathy, fake concern she used when other mothers were watching her. I deleted it. The second message, 7:30 a.m., Evelyn again. Riley, this isn't funny. You missed Chloe's brunch reservation. If this is a tantrum about the car, it is incredibly immature. Come home immediately. I snorted loudly in the empty room, still trying to control the narrative, still reducing my existence to petty jealousy. I skipped to a message from 9:45 a.m. It was Richard. The background noise was quiet, the deadened, soundproofed acoustics of his home office. Listen to me very carefully, you little bitch. His voice was a low, vibrating growl, stripped of all its country club polish. It was the voice he used when a business deal was falling apart. I don't know how you got the combination, and I don't care. You have no idea what you're holding. Those documents are legally privileged. You are committing corporate espionage and grand larceny. If you do not walk back through my front door with that folder in the next hour, I am calling the police. I will ruin your life. Call me. My thumb hovered over the screen. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a primal, conditioned panic flooding my veins. 18 years of being terrified of that voice told me to run, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. But then I looked around the drafty, imperfect room. I felt the rough texture of the quilt. I remembered the dates on those bank transfers. He couldn't call the cops. If he called the cops, the folder went into evidence. He was trapped, and he knew it. The threat was empty, the desperate thrashing of an animal caught in a snare. I let the phone drop onto the mattress. I didn't cry. The tears I thought I might shed for the family I just lost never materialized. I just felt a heavy, numb clarity. I dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes and walked out to the kitchen. The smell of frying bacon and burnt toast hung heavy in the air. Arthur was standing by the stove, a spatula in his hand, staring out the window at the gray, churning ocean. He didn't turn around when my boots scuffed against the linoleum. Your phone buzzing woke me up 2 hours ago. Sounded like an angry hornet. They noticed the safe, I said flatly. I pulled out a chair and sat down. Arthur grunted, flipping the bacon. I imagine Richard is having a hard time digesting his breakfast. He turned off the burner and scooped the food onto 2 chipped plates, sliding one across the table to me. Eat. I picked up a piece of bacon. It was burnt on the edges, greasy and perfect. I took a bite, the salty crunch grounding me in the moment. Arthur sat down, ignoring his own food. He reached under his chair and pulled up a small, beat-up cigar box. The wood was scratched, the brass hinges completely rusted. He slid it across the table until it bumped against my plate. Before we get into the mud with these people, Arthur said, his voice unusually soft, you need to know what we're actually fighting for. It's not just the money, Riley. It's the principle of who you are. I wiped my fingers on a paper napkin and carefully opened the box. Inside, it didn't smell like cigars. It smelled like dried roses and old acidic paper. There was a silver locket, tarnished black. A hospital wristband, tiny and brittle, with my birth date printed on it, and beneath that, a stack of photographs. I picked up the top photo. It was a Polaroid, the colors washed out and bleeding at the edges. It showed a young woman sitting on the hood of the same rusty blue Ford truck currently parked outside. She had wild, dark, curly hair blowing across her face. She was laughing, her head thrown back, a genuine, full-bodied laugh that reached her eyes. She was holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a yellow blanket. I stared at the woman's face, the slope of her nose, the sharp angle of her jaw. I was looking in a mirror. Her name was Sarah, Arthur said gently. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at the yellow bundle. And she loved you more than breathing. She worked 2 jobs to build that trust for you. She wanted you to go to college, to travel, to never have to depend on anybody. When she got sick, Richard was her boss at the firm. He stepped in, played the savior, promised her he'd handle the legalities so I wouldn't have to worry about the paperwork. Arthur's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding audibly. She trusted him. We both did. He was drawing up the adoption papers before she was even in the ground. A hot, stinging pressure built behind my eyes. The dam broke. I didn't sob beautifully. It was ugly, jagged crying. My chest heaved, pulling in ragged gasps of the wood smoke-scented air. I clutched the photograph so tightly, the stiff paper bent under my thumbs. 18 years of being told I was a burden, a discarded mistake rescued by saints. 18 years of shrinking myself to fit into their immaculate, loveless house. My mother hadn't abandoned me. She had secured my future, and they had stolen it, erasing her memory while cashing her checks. Arthur didn't try to hug me. He didn't tell me it was going to be okay. He just sat there, a silent, steady anchor in the room, letting me shatter. When the tears finally stopped, leaving me hollowed out and exhausted. I carefully placed the photograph back into the cigar box. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve, the rough cotton scratching my damp cheeks. I reached for my phone on the table. The screen lit up. 3 new messages from Evelyn. I looked up at Arthur. The sadness in my chest was gone, entirely replaced by a cold, calculating fury. "Do you know a good lawyer in town?" I asked, my voice hoarse but completely steady. Arthur finally smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was a predatory showing of teeth. "I know the meanest son of a bitch in Clatsop County. He hates Richard's firm almost as much as I do." "Good," I said, picking up the blue folder. "Let's make a call." Mitchell's office smelled aggressively of stale coffee and lemon-scented floor wax. It was a cramped, windowless room on the second floor of a brutalist concrete building in downtown Portland, completely devoid of the curated, intimidating elegance of Richard's corporate firm. Mitchell himself was a squat, balding man with permanent coffee stains on his tie and a razor-sharp mind that operated with surgical cruelty. It took exactly 12 days to trap them. 12 days of Mitchell filing injunctions, freezing assets, and sending heavily redacted copies of the blue folder's contents to Richard's board of directors. The mediation was set for a Tuesday morning. I sat at a cheap particle board conference table, tracing the wood grain laminate with my thumbnail. The AC unit rattled violently in the corner. Arthur sat beside me, dressed in a faded corduroy suit that smelled faintly of mothballs, his large hands resting perfectly still on his knees. The heavy door clicked open. Richard and Evelyn walked in, followed by 2 nervous-looking junior attorneys carrying thick leather briefcases. My breath hitched, a purely involuntary physical response to 18 years of conditioning. Evelyn looked haggard. The heavy concealer under her eyes couldn't hide the bruising shade of purple, and her normally immaculate blowout was limp. Richard looked worse. The arrogant flush was completely gone from his face, replaced by a sickly, pallid gray. He looked smaller. They sat down across from us. The junior attorneys immediately began shuffling papers, trying to manufacture a sense of control in a room where they had absolutely none. "Riley," Evelyn started, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. She reached a manicured hand across the table, her rings clinking against the laminate. "Sweetheart, please. You don't understand what you're doing to this family, to Chloe." She had to return the car. I didn't move. I just stared at her hand until she slowly pulled it back, her fingers curling inward like a dying spider. Mitchell cleared his throat, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He slid a single, stapled document across the table. It stopped inches from Richard's trembling fingers. "The terms are simple," Mitchell said, his voice a low, gravelly hum over the rattling AC. "You liquidate the Aspen property. You liquidate the offshore accounts. You drain your personal portfolios. Every red cent stolen from Sarah Pendleton's trust is replaced, with compounded interest, by Friday afternoon." Richard stared at the paper. A bead of sweat broke loose from his hairline and tracked slowly down his temple. He didn't wipe it away. "And if we agree to this, extortion?" he rasped. "Then we don't hand the unredacted files over to the SEC and the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Mitchell replied brightly, tapping his pen against his coffee mug. "Though, personally, I'd love to see how you explain forging a dead man's signature to a federal judge. I hear white-collar prison is a real adjustment." Richard's eyes finally flicked up to meet mine. There was no fatherly disappointment there. There wasn't even anger. It was pure, naked terror. I saw the exact moment the illusion of his untouchable power completely shattered. He wasn't a patriarch. He was a parasite, and the host had just ripped him off. "You're destroying me," Richard whispered, his voice cracking, "over money you don't even know how to spend." "It was never about the money, Richard," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, and completely devoid of the fear that used to choke me. "It was about Sarah. You erased my mother so you could buy a vacation home. You told me I was nothing, so I would be grateful for the scraps you fed me. Sign the paper." The silence in the room stretched out, agonizing and thick. The ticking of the cheap wall clock sounded like a hammer against an anvil. Slowly, his hand shaking so violently he could barely grip the silver barrel, Richard clicked his Mont Blanc pen. He signed his name on the bottom line. He didn't look at me again. He didn't look at Evan Velen, who was quietly weeping into a tissue. He just stood up, his expensive suit hanging off him like a shroud, and walked out of the room. I didn't feel a sudden, euphoric rush of victory. There were no fireworks. The heavy knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest for my entire life simply unspooled, leaving behind a profound, aching emptiness that I knew would take years to fill. 3 hours later, I was back in Astoria. The tide was rolling out, leaving behind a vast expanse of dark, wet sand, dotted with tangled clumps of olive green kelp. The sky was an unbroken canopy of bruised gray clouds, and the wind was vicious, stinging my cheeks with salt spray and the smell of ozone. I stood near the edge of the water, my heavy combat boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. My hands were shoved deep into the pockets of a heavy wool sweater Arthur had found in a cedar chest, my mother's sweater. It smelled like dust and faint traces of dried lavender. It fit me perfectly. I heard the heavy crunch of boots on the sand behind me. Arthur stopped a few feet away, lighting a cigarette with a cupped hand to block the relentless wind. He didn't push for conversation. He was content to just stand there, a solid, immovable fixture against the churning backdrop of the Pacific Ocean. I pulled the battered brown manila envelope out of my pocket. The cheap Spirit Airlines itinerary was still inside, crumpled and soft from being handled so much. I stared at the messy handwriting, the ink slightly blurred from the rain. I didn't have a curated, perfect life ahead of me. I had a drafty house, a rusty Ford pickup, and an ocean that looked like it wanted to swallow the world. I had a grandfather with too much baggage and a mother whose memory I had to reconstruct from old Polaroid pictures and rusted cigar boxes. It was messy. It was cold. It was loud. I let the envelope fall from my hand. The wind caught it immediately, whipping it across the sand and out over the dark rolling waves until it disappeared completely. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing, salt-heavy air fill my lungs until they ached. For the first time in my life, I felt completely real. If Riley's journey from a discarded afterthought to a force of absolute reckoning resonated with you, show your support by hitting the like button. Share this story with anyone who knows the power of walking away from toxic environments to find where they truly belong, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, grounded stories about reclaiming your power and rewriting your own narrative. Your continued support helps bring more stories like this to life.